Hi, everyone. My name is Father Patrick Rogers, and I'm a Jesuit priest here at the University of Scranton, where I'm the executive director of the Jesuit Center. And our main task at the University of Scranton is to help articulate the Ignatian and Catholic values to our faculty and staff so that they can understand it, and then, of course, give it to our wonderful students here at the university. I'm really thankful to be talking to you today. I'd like to thank Father Jeffrey and Ellen of St. Eulalia's Parish and all those in the Ignatian Volunteer Corps as well for inviting me to speak to you about this great topic, something that's so close to my own heart. So the name of this presentation is called God's Deepening Life in Me, Lessons from St. Ignatius. So for the next 5 weeks, we'll be diving into ways in which we can learn from this great saint how to open ourselves up to God, which allows for a deepening relationship with God to happen. So I'm delighted also to be working with some great folks on this project. We have IHM Sister Chris Kohlhofer, Mr. Dennis Doggart, who's a retired pediatrician and also a spiritual director, and Teddy Michael, who is the director of the Ignatian Volunteer Corps for Northeast Pennsylvania. What I'm going to do for you tonight is to give a very brief outline of Ignatius's biography and tell you about some of the most important events of his life and detail how God was deepening his life in the life of St. Ignatius. Now, again, this is not going to be an exhaustive thing. The biography is actually on the website. I'm not going to go over all of it because all of it isn't particularly relevant, but it's something that you really should read. And just so you know, if you have any questions about anything that I've said tonight, you can certainly save it for the Zoom call. So please write those things down and we'll deal with them when we have our Zoom call. So just so you know, those of us who are Jesuits, Ignatius's life serves as a model, not to be strictly emulated, but rather to serve as a lesson of the ways in which God speaks to a soul. As a matter of fact, the early biographies of Ignatius often had titles, things like how God was dealing with the soul of Ignatius, God's working on a soul. That was a very big theme of the early Jesuits, and it's something that we Jesuits still treasure and hold dear because, again, we do see in Ignatius this model for how he continually opened himself up to the reality of God's love in his life. Now, indeed, the witness of the saints, prophets, matriarchs, and patriarchs all serve as a model for us. So it's not just St. Ignatius's life journey that tells us about God's deepening love, but for those of us in the Ignatian world, it is a way that's very accessible to us. And Ignatius was also a man that, frankly, was a man that many of us can relate to. And you'll hear more about that as I talk about his biography. All of the talks in this series concern deeply held Ignatian concepts or ways of proceeding. These monikers point to a specific way in which Ignatius experiences God's deepening life growing inside of him and ways he encourages others to do the same. So again, the 5 weeks that we have, the topics are going to be this. Tonight is the biography of Ignatius. Next week, Dennis Doggart will be speaking about finding God in all things. The week after that, becoming a contemplative in action. Teddy Michaels is going to be talking about that. Looking at the world in an incarnational way. Sister Chris is tackling that topic. And then Dennis is going to come back to do seeking freedom and detachment in our fifth week. Each of these 4 ways of proceedings are singular and complementary at the same time. And hopefully you'll be able to see all of those connections at the end of this series. So one other thing before I launch into Ignatius's biography. At the beginning of the spiritual exercises, Ignatius writes out for us the first principle and foundation. And that looks like this. You're going to see this on the website as well. Again, as you see, it's very short. But this is kind of a lens with which Ignatius understands the world. And so the themes that we're going to be discussing are also found in that first principle. And since that's found at the beginning of the spiritual exercises, it's going to be a kind of a key concept to understand and to know as we go forward. So it is the lens by which we Jesuits still engage the world, this first principle and foundation. And each of the weekly themes will touch upon some aspect of Ignatius's first principle and foundation. So I just want you to know that as we begin the series. Okay, so the biography that is up on the website is broken down into 9 different parts. So I'm just going to address a couple of things, if not only one thing, for each one of those parts that I think is important for us to understand about Ignatius and how this biography, how his life unfolds before us and how God is working on this soul. So the early years. Ignatius was born in 1491. He was born to a reasonably wealthy family. They weren't, super wealthy, but they certainly were not peasants. They were landed aristocracy. Ignatius's grandfather had some issues with some of the local kings, and they kind of took him down a peg. But basically, Ignatius grew up in some very privileged circles. As a young man, he went to Madrid to be in a court of Isabella, and so that famous court. And he was a page there, and so he was a very privileged young man. And while he was there, he certainly learned. He went to school, if not for very long. He certainly knew how to read and write. He certainly would have learned music. The things that people said about him at that time was that he was a very great dancer. He was a quite dashing young man. He was very handsome. He was a ladies' man. And he also liked to brawl. He is known as someone who would fight at the drop of a hat. He used to drink a lot. He was, frankly, a guy that I probably would not have wanted to hang around with. It's not just because I'm wearing a collar. I don't like people like that. If I'm in a bar with somebody and they want to get into a fight, I'm not a good fighter, so I don't want to do that. So it's probably somebody that I would not have wanted to hang out with. Probably not you either. But again, he himself talked about his own vanity. He was very concerned about his looks. He was very concerned about his status. He was very concerned about the way he came off to people. And if people disrespected him at all, that's when, again, gloves come off, knife comes out, sword comes out. Yeah, not a good guy. As a matter of fact, the only thing that we have about St. Ignatius, other than Jesuit documents, kind of official Jesuit documents, is a court record where Ignatius, and I believe it was a cousin of his, actually ambushed somebody at night and almost killed him. And the only reason he wasn't in jail was because this person didn't die. This person ended up recovering. And again, Ignatius had some connections and basically he got out of this. But again, this was not good. Ignatius was not that kind of a guy that most of us would want to emulate, that's for sure. He became a soldier. So the second one is he became a soldier. He was working for the Duke of Navarro. And he was a very brave man, pretty impetuous man. So at the Battle of Pamplona between the Basque people and the French, Ignatius was actually doing some pretty stupid things and he ended up getting hurt. The garrison at Pamplona was overwhelmed by numbers. I mean, there weren't that many men fighting for Pamplona. There were thousands of men for the French, but Ignatius, in his stubborn vanity, decided, screw this, we're going to fight on. And he was even on the rampart waving a battle flag. And when a cannonball came and right between his legs, and it shattered one leg and severely hurt the other one. The Pamplona, the fortress fell. Ignatius was really dying. But the French were so, frankly, astounded by his heroic exploits and bravery that they actually carried him back to his home castle, Loyola, which as the crow flies is not that far from where Pamplona is. It's certainly a couple of weeks if you're bearing a gurney, but I think maybe 60 miles or something like that, maybe a little bit more, but not that much. So he goes back to his home. He's badly hurt, and again, he comes inches of dying. At one point, he really does think he's dying, and he just miraculously started to heal the next day, and he does attribute that as a miracle. It was on the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul. So he had a long recovery when he was at his house in Loyola. One of the things that marked it was in his vanity, his leg was completely shattered, and when they set it, it wasn't set correctly. He wanted it to be rebroken, and part of a bone sawed off because it wouldn't look good if he was in those tight hose that men used to wear at that time. Can you imagine the pain? This is, again, in the 16th century. The pain that this must have been, it was just excruciating. But he was a brave guy. Also, there wasn't much to read in the house. And so he started reading the lives of the saints and the life of Christ. And he really did start this inner kind of conversion. He was born into a Catholic family. He certainly would have gone to church, but there was more about culture than about morality for his family. But he feels this spirit stirring inside of him, and this is really important because he could have ignored these spirits moving inside of him. He started to understand in his life, when he thought about the worldly things that were happening in his life, about the court and about women and about all those things, he didn't feel dissatisfied necessarily, but he did feel dry. But whenever he read about the great saints like Francis of Assisi or Dominic or any of the great saints, he felt not only contentment, a deep contentment, but it didn't go away. So it wasn't like when he thought about, again, the court, he would have these moments of, wow, that was a lot of fun, or that was really glorious. But then he would get kind of dry again. When he thought about the saints and about the life in Christ, he kept feeling just a deeper spirituality, a deeper consolation inside of his heart. Now, he didn't know what this was really all about, but he kept trusting this experience, and he decides at one point that he wants to go on a pilgrimage. So he's going to be a pilgrim. He's going to give up some of these vain ways, and he's going to go to Jerusalem. He wants to go to the Holy Land. He wants to go to where Jesus went so he can see the places where Jesus was, and frankly, convert the infidels. He was kind of on fire with this idea that I'm going to go convert to Israel. The Muslims in the Holy Land. So he becomes a pilgrim. This is after a considerable convalescence at his own home. He leaves. And he goes to a Benedictine monastery, which is near Barcelona. This is in the southern part of Spain now. And it's called Montserrat. It's a very famous monastery. You can still look it up again. There's some material on the website about it. So look it up. It's astoundingly beautiful and ancient. And he prays in front of the Madonna there, and he hands over his sword and his dagger. Now, that's a metaphorical thing. He's changing his life. And so he's saying to God, I want to give these things up. These things were instruments that actually brought destruction to me. But the other part of that that's really important to understand is when he's giving up his knife and his sword, he's giving up the means of protecting himself. Again, he was a man who was not liked by a lot of people, and he had real enemies. And so I can imagine him putting that sword up there and saying, I'm going to trust God in all things, was a really, really big deal. And even when you think about walking on roads, back in those days, bandits could have been around any corner. There were no cops to go to. I mean, so if somebody was going to rob you or beat you or something, they could do it pretty easily and with impunity. So Ignatius was giving up a lot and giving over a sword and his dagger. And again, he prepares to go to the Holy Land. However, he decides that he's going to stay in this town called Manresa, which is just below the mountains where Montserrat is. And he's going to stay there for a while. The Spirit is really moving him. So he stays there for 10 months. He was only going to stay a few days. He ends up staying 10 months. And this is where the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius are born. He's writing down notes about how God is laboring and working inside of his own life, how the evil spirit is trying to affect his life. That all kinds of wild things happen to him when he's at Manresa. Again, he spends 10 months there. He has these great fights with his own evil, with his own sinfulness, the things that he did that were sinful. And he also feels these great consolations as well. So he's really, just think of him like the devil on one side and the angel on the other, constantly speaking into his ears, and his heart is just being rent back and forth very profoundly. But he starts writing down the notes about what is happening. When he prays about these kind of things, he's feeling, again, consolation. When he thinks about certain other things, he's feeling desolation. He even starts to realize that some things that I thought were good actually turn out to be bad, that the devil will disguise himself as something that is good just to trick people. It's a fascinating time of his life. And again, he's writing out these spiritual exercises. He was also doing these extreme penances. So for instance, he would go days without eating or drinking. He went for a long time without cutting his hair or cutting his fingernails or his toenails. He must have looked like a crazy man. And of course, when he's out and about, he was trying to preach the good news to like kids and people on the street. They fled from him. And so, part of his discernment was to realize, maybe if I cut my hair and trim my nails and look reasonable, like wash my face, that people aren't going to flee from me thinking I'm some crazy guy. And he learns a lot about even the fasting and things of that nature. He hurt himself a lot when he was there, even internally. He had stomach problems for his entire life, and he traces those back to the extreme penances that he had done when he was at Manresa. One of the things, though, he learned there, and he forbids any Jesuit to do any kind of specific fasting without the permission of his rector. And that's to protect against overly scrupulous men who want to engage in some severe form of penance that's actually hurting themselves. And so we have to get permission to do those things because of Ignatius's own experience. Okay, so he becomes a pilgrim. He leaves Manresa, and he does go to the Holy Land. He's so excited to be in the Holy Land. However, he only stays there for a couple of weeks because the Franciscans who are running the place don't want this guy wandering around trying to convert Muslims and, again, kind of acting a little bit loony. They thought this is the last thing we need. And they literally, Ignatius said that he was coming back from someplace that he wasn't supposed to be, and this Franciscan brother literally basically hauls him up and grabs him by the scarf of the neck and basically takes him inside and says, "You're on the next boat out of here, buddy." And so Ignatius, ends up going back to Venice and eventually back to Barcelona. And instead of just going, the hell with all this, I thought that God had a plan for me. I was sure I was supposed to go to the Holy Land. I was sure I was supposed to do these things. And because that didn't happen, the heck with all this, I'm just going to go back to the court. I'm going to do whatever I want to do, and the hell with it all. But he doesn't do that. Again, he's a very humble man. And the first thing he thought was, okay, I really did think I was supposed to do this. However, it clearly didn't work out. That does not mean that God does not have a plan for me. I must have misinterpreted. I must have misdiscerned. And I have to go back and, again, relearn what is it that God wants of me? How is God deepening God's life inside of me that I may come closer to God so I know God's will to be able to do God's will? So that's an important lesson he learned there. In Barcelona, he stays there for 2 years, and he becomes a student again. He has an inkling that he wants to be a priest, but he needs to know Latin. He doesn't know Latin very well. He would have learned a little bit in the courts. So he goes back to school, and he literally goes to school with kids who are like 8 to like 12 years old, learning Latin. Some of them might be a little older. Could you imagine? This guy was in his 30s. This guy's like 33, 34 years old, in classrooms with these little kids being taught Latin, the rudiments of Latin. But again, in his humility, it was a free education, and he needed it. And so he engaged in that for a couple of years. He ends up going to a university in Alcalá, Spain. It's near Madrid. And then he goes to Salamanca, which is a very famous university. And in both of those places, he has problems. Now, the reason he has problems, this is the 1520s. And what is now happening in especially Central Europe is the Reformation is all in full force. Again, in 1517, Luther nails his theses to the church in Wittenberg. So especially in Central Europe, the Reformation is definitely on. And there's a lot of tension between a lot of different religious authorities. It hasn't really hit Spain or Italy and even France, most of France. Those are still very solidly Catholic countries, but they were wary of people who were preaching different things. So Ignatius is going around talking to people about spirituality, giving the spiritual exercises or the rudimentary parts of the exercises that he had worked out. And frankly, the religious authorities haul him to jail a number of times. Basically, they haul him in front of the Inquisition and say, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "Well, I'm just talking about God. I just want to preach God's word, et cetera, et cetera." But in some ways, he was causing some confusion among people, not only but among the bishops and the hierarchy, but even the lay people. Well, like, who is this guy? He seems to be talking with authority, yet he doesn't have any authority at all from the church, so to speak. And he learns a lot from that. Again, he says, well, if I have to get a degree and call it this Master of Arts and be ordained, well, that's what I'm going to do. So he leaves Salamanca and he ends up going to Paris, probably the greatest university at that time in all the world. And what's even more interesting is his two roommates were, his first roommates were a guy named Francis Xavier and a guy named Peter Faber, both of whom are saints, both members of the Society of Jesus. They helped found the society with Ignatius, and both extraordinary saints in their own right. You can look them up on your own. St. Francis Xavier, one of the great missionaries. St. Peter Faber, the master of giving the spiritual exercises of Ignatius. They were so moved by Ignatius and by his way of engaging the world through these spiritual exercises that both were drawn to do the exercises. Francis Xavier actually put it off for a long time, but his friend Peter Faber and Ignatius finally warmed down, and once he did the spiritual exercises, his mind was just blown, his heart was blown. This vehicle, the exercises for coming closer to God, changed his life and changed the world forever. And again, those two great saints did all these great things. So while at Paris, Ignatius gets his degree, a master's degree, as do Peter Faber and Francis Xavier. And also in 1534, they take vows as friends in the Lord. There are 10 of them who have come together as kind of a fraternity, so to speak, spiritual fraternity in Paris. And they decide they want to vow themselves to the church, poverty, chastity. And they didn't really vow obedience, because you have to vow obedience to somebody. But, obedient to whatever religious authority had authority over them at that time, whether it be in Paris or whatever. And so they became the beginning of the Society of Jesus. They called themselves Friends in the Lord. And again, even later on, when the Society of Jesus is formed, it was initially called, well, in Spanish, they still call it La Compañía de Jesús, the company of Jesus. Compañía, companion, comes from to eat bread with, compan, companion, to eat bread with. And so the idea of feasting together, of sharing the Eucharist together, was really important. Of course, it still is really important in the Society of Jesus and in the Catholic world. So that's the beginning, in some ways, of the Society of Jesus. The men still don't quite know what they're going to do. They have different plans. They wanted to go back maybe to the Holy Land to do specific work there. They decide basically in the late 1530s that they're going to end up in Rome and basically go to the Pope and say, there's a group of men here that want to do good. We're ready to be a religious order. We have a leader. They did elect Ignatius the leader. They initially didn't have a leader. They elected Ignatius a leader, and they go to the Pope and say, we want to put ourselves at your disposal. Where does the church need folks? And so part of our foundational documents have to do with how we serve the church. If you know things about religious orders, like Franciscans do work with the poor, Dominicans are great scholars and known for preaching. Benedictines, of course, pray, and they're great masters of prayer and liturgy. But for Jesuits, we're known for education, which is a big deal in the Society of Jesus. But also, if you go to a far-flung place in the world, like the remotest jungle of the Amazon, or some island way out in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific, and there's a priest there, odds are it could be a Jesuit. That's part of our charism. the Pope actually asks us to go to places that, frankly, are really on the frontiers. So if there's a space colony going to Mars or something like that, it wouldn't be surprising at all, at least to us, Jesuits, that the Pope would say, I need a Jesuit because you all are used to this. This is part of your charism. Who's going to go to Mars and never come back and minister to these people? That would be something that would be very Jesuitical. So the first companions are formed. They're formed in 1540, and we officially become the Society of Jesus. Now, some things that Ignatius learned about from what he learned about God deepening his life in all of this. Every step of the way, Ignatius was engaged in something that he would call discernment. Well, actually, it's called discernment, I guess I should say. He initially, when he was doing this, when he was laid up and convalescing, he didn't realize exactly how this was going to change his life. But through the constant examining of his own life, about his own daily routines, he came to know where he was profoundly unfree. And that's really important, what his disordered attachments were to things. And because he had a disordered attachment to, again, his vanity at one time, or his, his sword fighting skills, whatever it might be, he missed the fact that God was actually trying to converse with him at all times. That God is laboring inside of every person. God is laboring in the world and in our communities. And if we miss that, it's because we miss it. It's not because God ain't there. It's because we ain't listening. So the idea of discernment, especially as recognized through this spiritual exercises and through the daily examination of conscience that we Jesuits do, helps a person to become freer, free from detachments, so they're free to engage in ministry, wherever that ministry is needed. So, for example, if my provincial, that's my boss, head boss, and he lives in Baltimore, if he came to me tomorrow and said, Pat, I need you to go to Timbuktu in Mali tomorrow to teach physics to a whole group of beautiful kids over there, I'd say, okay, can I have a day to say goodbye? And he'd probably say yes, but he might even say, no, I need you right now. That's part of our Jesuit obedience, is to be able to do those kind of things and to go places where other people aren't necessarily going. But it's also a trusting in God, that God is going to be with me. So I don't have to presume or even question, oh, is God going to be with those beautiful kids in Mali? Is he going to be in Timbuktu? Of course God is going to be in Timbuktu. God is everywhere. It's a matter of opening myself up to the reality of how am I going to engage these people? How am I going to find God in those people and in my ministry there? So that's just one way of understanding something about Ignatius's life. Again, what's I think most profoundly important, though, again, is this idea of Ignatius's just conviction that beyond all things, God loves us so profoundly. So profoundly. There's nothing we can do to change that. And that does change the way we see the world. Once you come to really own that, and part of owning it is, again, doing retreat work or doing the spiritual exercises and really having to wrestle like Ignatius did when he was at Manresa. Wrestle with your own inner demons and your inner angels and come to conclusions about the ways that you may have thwarted God's Spirit trying to work in your life, and the ways that God's beautiful love has flowered in your life, the way you've been created, the family that loves you, friends that animate you, a beautiful church and a parish community or a group of folks that come together to give meaning to your life. All that stuff is so very important. So anyway, let's not forget about those things. Now, in closing, all of this, the reason, again, we wanted to start with the biography is because, again, it's the way Ignatius learned how God was deepening his life inside of him. So we can see these movements and also the way Ignatius himself interpreted those things. So again, now it's up to you in some senses. Again, you're going to be doing this, of course, in your own life, we hope. You're going to be discerning how God has been deepening God's relationship with you in very particular ways. Now, some of the things that we're going to be looking at is specific ways to doing that. Again, if you remember, let me make sure I get this right. So we're going to be, again, next week, we've got finding God in all things. Then it's going to be talking about how St. Ignatius specifically uses this term to understand how there's nothing in our world that isn't a part of something that can help us come closer to God or turn us away from God. Anything. It could be anything from money to sexuality. All of those things are important things in our lives. They can be used for good and they can be used for bad. Okay, so Ignatius, didn't eschew any of those things if they were leading somebody to a deeper relationship with God. Again, the second week, after that, becoming a contemplative in action, this idea of discerning what's happening in your life so that you can see the mark better, so to speak, and actually go out and engage the world in very appropriate ways. Looking at the world in an incarnational way, that's a very Catholic way of seeing the world. Incarnation, flesh is important. That's why the church takes stands against abortion, against euthanasia, even pro things like we have to take care of poor people. They are incarnate things that have to be taken care of. We don't hope that they do better. We have to work so that those folks do better. And then lastly, the seeking freedom and detachment. Again, right out of the spiritual exercises, how St. Ignatius understood how evil can corrupt one's heart to not see how God is laboring in one's life. And so how do we uncover that? How do we detach ourselves from those things that keep us from loving God and from God deepening God's life within us? So that's what I've got for you today. I can't wait for our discussion that's going to happen, I believe, sometime next week. And until that time, be blessed. And again, if you have any questions, please write them down and we'll discuss them. Okay? God bless.